There are Brazilians who watched exactly one review on my channel and went, you know what you'll enjoy? 4 Days in September. And you know what? They were absolutely right.
O que é isso, companheiro?
Hi, I'm Lady Genevieve, I'm Japanese, and on my channel I talk about entertainment media. Today's review is going to be about the film 4 Days in September, also known as O Que É Isso, Companheiro. Can any Brazilians clarify what the literal translation is? Because the film's Wikipedia page says, "What is this, comrade?" But the author's Wikipedia page says, "What was that, man?" And Google Translate says, "What's up, mate?" So what is the truth? Before I get into my feedback of this film, I would also like to ask the follow-up question of where this title originates. As in, is there a specific point of origin within that source material? I'm aware that the book has the same title as the film, but I haven't read that, so I'm not really sure. I'm mostly asking because I find it can be quite interesting to note the differences in film titles when they get translated into different languages. Sometimes the meaning can stay fairly similar, but other times it can be wildly different. Just as an example, if any of you know the film The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, do you know what the original title of that is? Men som hatar kvinnor. Do you know what the direct translation of that is? Men Who Hate Women. The original title is very on the nose about the film's subject matter, and then the English language market went, let's make it sound like a movie for edgy teenagers, which it most certainly is not. But anyway, if you speak the language, let me know what the original title refers to. Now, originally I was searching for this film on various streaming platforms or on iTunes. It was not available there. There is an upload of it on YouTube, but I didn't go towards that initially because I had thought, well, that's not going to work for me because I need subtitles. Then I decided I would just try that version out and see if the automatic Google Translate feature would be sufficient enough for me to be able to follow along with the plot, because I really did want to watch this film because the premise looked interesting. And then I clicked through onto this YouTube upload, and guess what? There were English subtitles embedded onto that upload, so I could watch and follow along with what was going on. First of all, it was a jump scare to see the Miramax name plastered in the film's opening. Those Weinstein brothers, they're like mildew, just rotten. Question for the Brazilians in the audience. Have you officially banned the Weinstein brothers from entering Brazil yet? Harvey's lawyers are trying to get him out of jail. It's terrible, and I'm rooting for all of you to never allow him entry. In watching this film, though, I'm kind of surprised that it was allowed to be released at all in the States. I mean, I enjoyed watching it, but I'm a James Cameron fan, so of course I love movies where violence isn't the answer. It's the solution. Main characters engaging in armed struggle against their oppressors. That's the entire premise of the Avatar movies. Now, this movie was released in 1997, and it was based on a book about real events. So for that reason, I am going to talk about the film with full spoilers. If you would like to watch it yourself, a non-HD version is available on YouTube, like I already said. I would love for Brazilians to chime in with any extra context, though, about if any details in the film are either different from the book or different from the real-life events that took place. I know that it's fairly standard that even when a film or television series is intended to adapt real-life events, there's probably at least some small details that won't be presented with 100% accuracy because the film needs to flow in a certain way to work within the film medium. Maybe the runtime limits how much information you can share, so things become consolidated. It's not necessarily the result of a malicious effort to obfuscate the truth. It can just be the result of trying to make a film that will in fact work as a film. But anyway, all of that to say, knowledge is power, so I'm more than happy to hear feedback from Brazilian viewers that are more knowledgeable about the historical details and provide those clarifications. But now, let me share my perspective of how I experienced watching this film for the first time. After that first Miramax jump scare, the film shares that in 1964, the democratic government of Brazil is overthrown in a military coup. That's a weird way to spell US-backed military coup, but okay. And then in 1968, the military junta that governs the country suspends all civil rights and freedom of the press. And while this text was showing, there's audible chanting in the background, and the rhythm of it sounded familiar to me, so I was wondering, hey, wait a moment, is that the Portuguese version of El Pueblo Unido Jamás Será Vencido? I am aware that Spanish and Portuguese are different languages, but they are both Romance languages, so I didn't think it was too peculiar of a guess for me to make. And judging by the subtitles that were displayed shortly thereafter, I am assuming that my guess was correct. Now, the film takes place in 1969 because that's when the kidnapping of the US ambassador to Brazil at the time, Charles Burke Elbrick, took place. And one of the first things you see in the film is the NASA moon landing, which also took place in 1969. And the dialogue of this scene took me through a whole array of emotions. So when I read the line, "One giant leap for mankind," they've never been known for their modesty. I had to stop and pause the film because I was laughing so much. That was a read. And it's not the only read in this film, but it was the first one that provoked an audible reaction out of me. And I was thinking about how, oh, well, I'm definitely going to need to go and find that one diagram, and in all likelihood say some things about how it was the cosmonauts who made the vast majority of milestones in the space race. And then I felt personally called out because more or less the very next line in the scene is,
Fosse camarada soviético, tava babando de prazer.
Ah, é, quando o Sputnik foi lançado, eu tomei porre. Depois eu tomei outro porre pela Laika.
Laika?
A cachorrinha que os russos mandaram pro espaço. Agora, porre mesmo, porre eu tomei pelo Gagarin. E aquele outro... Titov.
It was at this moment that I knew that the Brazilians who had recommended this film to me were absolutely right to do so. Their instincts were spot on. You know, the first Latin American who went to space achieved that milestone with the cosmonauts. He's an Afro-Cuban named Arnaldo Tamayo Mendes. He's still alive today in Cuba. The cosmonauts also put the first woman in space. She's still alive in Russia today, Valentina Tereshkova. And they also put the first Asian in space, a Vietnamese man who, like the others, is still alive today in Vietnam. And of course, I immediately clocked the poster of Ernesto Guevara in the background. And an interesting bit of trivia that I found online was that the group that the main character of the film, who goes on to become the eventual author of the book that this film is based on, that group he ends up joining, MR8, was partially renamed after the particular date that Guevara was taken captive by Bolivian forces. And that actually brings me to one of my favorite details about the film and the group of characters we follow for most of the film's runtime. I really appreciated how knowledgeable they are about the world. It's very frustrating nowadays to live in a world where there is so much of a push towards anti-intellectualism, particularly in English language spaces. So I found it refreshing to follow along with people who are knowledgeable about more places than just the one that they live in. Now, maybe if you're Brazilian and you're watching this review, you're thinking, well, of course they would know about other places, but I really have to stress that it's very alarming to watch how the literacy rates have gone down in so-called developed or first world countries, specifically because of policies being implemented to try to make the masses less educated and less knowledgeable about how to go about liberating themselves and others. So it just felt like a breath of fresh air to watch a film and be able to get emotionally invested in characters who had that global geopolitical perspective. They knew about the cosmonauts winning the space race. They've got Ernesto Guevara on the wall. They're bringing up the Vietnam War when they're speaking with Elbrick.
Are you also in favor of American intervention in Vietnam?
They've got the book The Prison Diaries by Ho Chi Minh, and Paulo expresses support for the Black Panthers.
But the Black Panther movement is a major challenge to the American establishment.
By the way, if any of you have HBO Max or you are able to access the documentary on another platform, I highly recommend watching the 1968 documentary Black Panthers by Agnes Varda. It's only half an hour long, but it's well worth the watch, and it documents a lot of interviews with Black Panther members during a period of time when they were protesting to demand the release of Huey Newton. But anyway, the protagonist of this film is Fernando, but I'm going to call him Paulo for most of this review because when he joins the MR8 group, one of the terms and conditions is that everyone who joins is given a fake name to use as an alias. It's a safety protocol that they have. But while he's still going by Fernando, we see him have this conversation with his friend Artur, and there's a massive ideological rift between them, which ultimately goes back to the difference between bourgeoisie and proletariat, which, if you read Marx and Engels' pamphlet, is repeatedly discussed in a surprising amount of detail considering that that pamphlet is in fact quite short. There are plenty of quotes from it that are applicable to this rift we see between these two people, but to try to give you an overview first of how Fernando and Artur differ, Fernando thinks that he needs to join a revolutionary group and take action against the ongoing US-backed dictatorship in Brazil. And Artur just wants to be an actor and go about his life doing whatever he wants. He thinks that voting or Congress can simply fix things, and that the situation at hand doesn't necessitate him taking some sort of steps to push back against this oppression that's in place. And so Fernando chides Artur for this type of thinking, outright identifying identifying it as bourgeois.
O que vocês vão fazer é legitimar essa ditadura.
Eles já se legitimaram sozinhos e estão vivendo muito bem sem nenhuma oposição. O que você propõe? Cruzar os braços em silêncio?
Só mergulhar numa aventura inconsequente. Pelo amor de Deus, Fernando, isso é porra louquice. A luta continua sendo política.
Mas de que luta política você está falando? A imprensa está censurada, o Congresso está covardado.
Uma frente ampla no Congresso pode derrubar essa canalha.
Isso é um pensamento pequeno burguês. A realidade está madura para a revolução.
To give you just a couple of examples of what Marx and Engels said about this type of bourgeois thinking and action, or lack thereof, a part of the bourgeoisie is desirous of redressing social grievances in order to secure the continued existence of bourgeois society. The socialistic bourgeois want all the advantages of modern social conditions without the struggles and dangers necessarily resulting therefrom. They desire the existing state of society minus its revolutionary and disintegrating elements. They wish for a bourgeoisie without a proletariat. And this is so relevant today, not just in Brazil, but countries all over the world, where you will have a group of people who may self-identify as being morally upstanding and progressive and wanting living and working conditions that are fair for everyone, in theory. But they will chide and deride the more radical people who actually try to take steps to push those things into existence. You will see people who are weirdly, nefariously antagonistic to anti-war protesters, even though it was anti-war protesters who fought so aggressively for the well-being of the world's humanity that you no longer have to worry about being drafted. Anti-Vietnam War protesters did that, but now you're angry at university students who are following in those same footsteps. And that's just one example, of course, but it applies to a multitude of things. So Fernando becomes Paulo when he joins MR8, and this is where we meet Maria, a leader in the group, and that's not her real name, but it is her alias. At this point, we're going to just be using the aliases unless I say otherwise. And Maria is played by Fernanda Torres. Hey girl, welcome back to the channel. And you know who else just joined MR8? Oswaldo. Do you know who plays him? Selton Mello. By the way, Brazilians in the audience, I repeatedly listened to a clip of Selton saying his own name, and it was very difficult for me to understand what exactly he was doing with his mouth in order to create the sounds that he was making. So I'm very sorry if I'm still struggling to say his name accurately. I think this is just one of those situations where I have not heard enough Portuguese to know how to mimic certain sounds as easily. Maybe once we work through more Brazilian films that I will eventually be reviewing here on YouTube, more things will start to click in my brain of how to pronounce more words and names correctly. But anyway, that's just very wild to me that Fernanda and Selton are back together. I mean, this is only the third Brazilian film I've reviewed here on YouTube, and 2 out of those 3 films have both of them in it. What exactly are the odds of that? I mean, Brazil is not a small country, so I do not assume that I'm going to keep seeing the same faces popping up in every film that I watch. Oh, and speaking of that, if you haven't already watched it, please feel free to go and watch my review of O Beijo da Mulher Aranha. Not a lot of people watch that, but it is up on my channel. And while we are talking about familiar faces, tell me why Fernanda Montenegro also makes an appearance in this film. The whiplash of her popping up and me going, again, hey girl, welcome back to the channel, to all of a sudden, whoa, wait a moment, why are you ratting out these revolutionaries who are trying to fight back against the ongoing dictatorship? Because she's only in this film for a short bit to call the police to report suspicious activity, which was the MR8 group when they were waiting around to try to catch the limo that's driving Ambassador Elbrick around. But actually, this brings me to another interesting point in this film where you have Artur with his bourgeois thinking. You have Fernanda Montenegro's character trying to report this suspicious activity to the police. Really? You're calling the police when you live under a right-wing military dictatorship. The math is not mathing. And then later on, there's a shopkeeper who calls the police on one of the MR8 members who has a suspicious amount of cash. All he was doing was coming in to buy some groceries. And this is how you treat your customers? So if we compare this film to Ainda Estou Aqui, this type of behavior wasn't something we saw as much because the majority of that other film's focus was on this one family that all love and support one another. So no one in that group is calling the police to rat on each other. And actually, it was this behavior of people calling the cops that ended up being the most unexpectedly disturbing part of the film for me to watch, because I already fully expected some sort of violent behavior and protocols from the cops that were working under this regime, because that's what they do. But to see people who are seemingly just normal, everyday people be so eager and enthusiastic to participate in the institutionalized violence of this dictatorship, that really unsettled baffled me. I really liked the way the film called out the performative politeness of people. This whole idea of seeming like a nice, honest person, an upstanding member of polite society, that means nothing when you lack the principles and convictions to stand on the right side of humanity. And that's one of the key points of the film's messaging that I found to be particularly intriguing and poignant. There is at least one more big thematic idea that the film explores that I would like to address before I end this review, but first I would like to touch on some of the main points that are more so typical of a film review. All of the acting was of course great, and the film was very effective in building tension in a way that I wasn't expecting, because in looking up the basic premise of the story and the real world events it was based on, I was already aware of the main beats of the plot. You have this revolutionary group of individuals who kidnap the US ambassador Elbrick, demand the release of some leftist political prisoners in exchange for his release. Those people were in fact released, and so the US ambassador was shortly thereafter also released. In total, he was held for a couple of days. The kidnapping was in 1969, and he did not die until 1983. But still, the buildup of the cops hunting this group and finding out where they were staying, it was very tense. And even though I knew that at least Paulo would be okay, at least in the sense that that man is still alive today in Brazil, he just turned 84 years old, I was still really worried about if he was going to survive, at least in the most visceral heat of the moment sense of the viewing experience. I would have to stop and remind myself that obviously he was going to live because he wrote the book that the film is based on. Now, I did not know that he was going to be captured and imprisoned and all of that horrific stuff that happens when you get imprisoned, because I had only skimmed the most basic information. I wasn't trying to read too many details if I could avoid them. I just wanted a bit of context beforehand, since it was something that was based on real events. But I do have to commend the film for being so effective in building up those dramatic stakes and the tension of the story, and the actors for putting so much nuance and range into the turmoil they experience in this very high stress situation. I do hope that this film becomes available in a more updated form though, because my experience of watching the film on YouTube did get impacted by the fact that it was a lower quality upload. The maximum was 360p. I mean, what is this, 2007? So I don't feel like I was able to get the full vision of the details of the visual language of how the film was filmed. But I did what I could with my very limited access to this film. It was either watch it in this form or not watch the film at all. I also really like the poetry of the writing and the part of the film where Elbrick is describing each member of MR8 through their hands. I found that part to be particularly beautiful in how it was written. And I was also fascinated by the fact that Alan Arkin was in this. He was the actor who played Ambassador Elbrick, and it made me wonder if this is just a job for him or if he has an affinity for putting this type of messaging out into the world by way of his art. And I don't fully know what the answer to that question is. However, when I did a quick skim of his career, I found out he was also in a movie about the Pentagon Papers, which, to be clear, I wasn't really aware of the fact that there was a film about the Pentagon Papers. If you didn't already know what that's referring to, it's the documents leaked by the late great whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg, who exposed a lot of ugly truths about what America was really doing in Vietnam. So naturally, I added that film to my Letterboxd watch list. But of course, the final point I want to talk about is this really interesting aspect of Paulo's character arc, though maybe at this point we should call him Fernando because that is his real name. So we begin with Fernando feeling this burning need to take action because of the horrors of the right-wing dictatorship that Brazil is experiencing. He's also very well read on the history and academic theory of revolution, other revolutionary causes, groups, and leaders spanning a number of places. So he joins this group, MR8, and he's the one who comes up with the plan to kidnap the US ambassador, because the very first mission we see the group do is rob a bank in order to secure funds that they will need for the material needs of enacting whatever their next revolutionary mission will be, but they also give a speech to the people that are inside the bank to try to get their message out and reach more people. But that doesn't work because of the dictatorship's control of the press. During that bank robbery, one of their members, Oswaldo, is shot in the leg and he's taken hostage by the dictatorship, and the viewers see that he is tortured into giving up the aliases of the other members of the group, as well as the location of the safe house that they had been staying in. But MR8 had already anticipated this, so by that point they had already moved to a different location. I point this out because it's important context to understanding that Their first move as a group was not to take a hostage. Violence is not something that comes naturally to them. When Fernando is Paulo, we watch him struggle tremendously with the idea of potentially having to kill Elbrick. It's not something he wants to do. They only did what they did out of desperation. A less violent approach was unsuccessful, and it only led to violence against one of their own group. And then after the whole ordeal of this specific scheme is finished and Paulo is back to being Fernando, he and Maria are now in hiding together, and her real name is Andrea, and they've become a romantic couple. They had struck up that romance during their time together while this MR8 group was active. Fernando says to her that he thinks they failed, but I don't think they did. They saved the lives of 15 political prisoners that in all likelihood would have died at the hands of the regime, and they let the ambassador go. So keep all of that in mind when I say that in skimming some of the English language feedback, it seemed as though some were suggesting that the film's messaging is muddled, and I have to completely disagree with that interpretation of the film. I think what the film is very astute in honing in on and presenting to the audience is the incredible toll that it takes on humans to enact violence, and that it is not a natural part of the human condition at this point in our evolution as a species. And moreover, it's going beyond just the aspect of physical violence. It's also addressing the emotional and psychological violence that people experience as a result of these dictatorships. So this is where I attempt to abbreviate things about psychology as a subject. Now, a lot of people seem to be very aware of how if you have a physical injury, you might have a lingering physical pain or scarring or other lingering symptoms that last longer than that initial healing process your body goes through. Well, going through trauma inflicts injury through the brain. The stress chemicals of your brain, the potentially long-lasting damage to your brain, the significance of that cannot be understated because the brain is the epicenter of everything to do with your emotions, your mood, your behavior, how you respond to stress, and so much more. So we watch this group be traumatized by the experience of having to engage in a level of violence and stay in a heightened state of stress and turmoil, of worrying about if they're going to be caught and found out, apprehended, subjected to torture, or just outright killed. The experience has lasting ramifications on them. That's why Paulo and Maria are so different from the people we initially meet at the beginning of the film. And this principle is also shown through the character of Henrique, whom we are repeatedly told struggles to sleep peacefully at night because he's a pig who tortures people, because that's his job. Really, man? That's your excuse? You really don't read any history, do you? So we see that the film is really emphasizing this thesis of how traumatizing it is to commit violence, as well as just exist in general under these dictatorships. But make no mistake, I do not have much sympathy for Henrique. When he was admitting his real job to his wife, and she was all, oh, but you don't torture those kids, right? And he's all, that too. And she's understandably horrified by this admission, especially when he pulls the whole I'm doing my job excuse.
Você não tá torturando aqueles garotos.
Isso também.
Ready to start yelling at the screen, girl, you need to leave. And I was getting so infuriated because he kept trying to justify himself, and she's very clearly trying to get away from him, but he keeps pushing into her space. I mean, am I surprised that you don't respect people's physical boundaries? No, not in the slightest. I know you're very used to violating people's boundaries and bodies. But anyway, all of that to say, I did not find the film's messaging to be muddled. It was merely probing deeper into the emotional and psychological layers of the human condition, of different people with different ideologies or occupations who are struggling in different ways under a US-backed military dictatorship. If you think it's muddled, I don't know what else to tell you. And just so I don't have to end things on too sad of a note, I really liked when Paulo dragged his actor friend when they had their encounter, and Arthur is still at it with his complacent bourgeois nonsense. He's trying to shame Paulo for making actual attempts to try to fight back, and he says to Arthur,
Vou te dizer uma coisa, dia, quando contarem a história do nosso tempo, todo mundo vai saber que grupo de pessoas pegou em armas para lutar contra a ditadura. Isso é importante, muito mais do que você pensa. Nem todo mundo se escondeu numa casa de boneca.
I was yelling because of how much I approved of that read. Drag him again. He deserves to be embarrassed. You think your boring local theater production is going to bring about progress for the people at large? I don't think so. I know that the film is obligated to follow along with a lot of real life events, so they can't provide too much of a fun or happy ending. Like, if this had been a fully fictional story, I definitely would have demanded that Henrique's wife had gotten rid of him and given him a dirt nap, but it was still a very enjoyable watch. And I do want to say thank you to all of the Brazilians who had recommended this film to me in my comments, because I really did have a lot of fun watching it. Or at least I had as much fun as I could have, considering the subject matter of the story. Those people were correct in their assessment of what sort of films I like to watch. I added this to my Revolution list on my Letterboxd account. Don't forget to follow me on Letterboxd. It's one of the only social medias I am still using. And if you would like to carry on with celebrating armed struggle in art, just wait until we get to my review of Freaky Tales, which I was able to watch recently. I loved that movie. Fascist skinheads being served some very violent karma. Oh, I had the time of my life with that. That's a strong contender to be in my top 10 of 2025. I have no doubt about that. And you know, it's a fictional story, so they can make it as fantastical and wish-fulfilling as they want. And that's exactly what they did.
There's too many of them.
That's bullshit. We fight.
But for those who live,